Imagine this. You are born into a world where every comfort cradles you, where silk cushions soften your weight, and the distant melody of musicians lulls your mind into a state of effortless peace. Servants anticipate your needs before you even think to ask, leaving you with nothing to do but breathe. Here, the gardens stretch endlessly in quiet perfection, and the walls, as beautiful as they are, act as a fortress, keeping out every disturbing sound, every worry, and every hint of the chaos beyond. Inside these walls, you are safe. You are at rest. The flowers in these gardens never wilt, at least, not where you can see them. Gardeners work through the night, removing any bloom that shows the slightest sign of fading, replacing it with something fresh and perfect. The servants who attend you are chosen for their youth and health and beauty. Anyone who falls ill or shows signs of aging is quietly reassigned to areas you never visit. The food is always perfectly prepared, served at exactly the right temperature, arranged to please the eye as much as the palate. Music drifts through the halls at all hours, soft enough to be pleasant, never intrusive, always there. You've never seen a beggar, never encountered someone deformed by disease or injury, never witnessed a funeral procession or heard the wailing of mourners. Your education has been the finest available, taught by wise teachers who fill your mind with poetry and mathematics, philosophy and history. You've been trained in every art a prince should know: archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, horsemanship. The text describes Siddhartha as naturally excelling at these skills, displaying the physical prowess expected of a prince from the warrior caste. This is your world. This has always been your world. You have no reason to suspect it's anything but reality. Why would you? When you ask questions, you receive answers. When you express interest in something, it appears. When you feel the slightest discomfort, someone rushes to remedy it. Life is an endless succession of pleasant moments, one flowing into the next like a stream of honey. Now imagine walking away from all of it, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in a quiet certainty that something essential is missing, that beneath the silk and gold and perfume, beneath the laughter and music and endless pleasures, there's a question no one around you seems willing to ask, a truth no one wants to see. Imagine discovering, after nearly 3 decades of this carefully curated existence, that everything you thought you knew was a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a lie told out of love and fear. A lie constructed by a father who wanted to protect you from the harsh realities of existence, who believed that if you never saw suffering, you'd never seek to escape from the world. You'd stay, inherit the kingdom, become a great ruler. You'd never become what the prophecy said you might become: a wanderer, a seeker, someone who abandons worldly power to find something more fundamental than kingdoms and armies and wealth. This is where our story begins, with a prince who had everything and discovered it was nothing, with a man who would become one of history's most influential spiritual teachers, not by claiming divine authority or performing miracles, but by sitting very still under a tree and paying attention to what is. His birth name was Siddhartha Gautama. The world would come to know him as the Buddha, which simply means the awakened one. But between the pampered prince and the enlightened teacher lies a journey that took him through every extreme the human experience offers: luxury and starvation, certainty and doubt, attachment and renunciation, life and something that transcends both life and death. This is the story of that journey, not because it happened 2,500 years ago to someone extraordinary, but because, in many ways, it's still happening, right now, in the quiet moments when you wonder if there's more to existence than what you've been told, in the dissatisfaction that creeps in despite having everything you thought you wanted, in the search for something you can't quite name. So settle in. Let the day's tensions ease from your shoulders, because we're going to walk with the prince out of his palace and into the unknown. We're going to sit with him under a tree as demons and gods and all the forces of the universe try to prevent what's about to happen. And we're going to witness the moment when a human being breaks through the illusion that has held our species captive since we first became conscious enough to suffer. The story begins, as so many stories do, with a birth and a prophecy. The prince in paradise. The year was somewhere in the 6th or 5th century BCE. Scholars debate whether it was closer to 563 BCE or perhaps a century later, and the exact dates remain uncertain. They know what matters in the small kingdom of Kapilavastu, nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what we now call Nepal. Queen Maya was making the traditional journey to her father's kingdom to give birth. She never made it. In a garden called Lumbini, ancient and sacred, Queen Maya stopped to rest. The trees were old there, their branches thick and sheltering. Later biographical texts would add miraculous details to this moment, that she reached up to grasp a branch of a sala tree and gave birth standing, that the child emerged from her right side, that lotus flowers bloomed where his feet first touched the earth, that he took 7 steps and proclaimed himself the most honored being in all the worlds. These are the mythological embellishments that grew around the story. What the earliest sources suggest is simpler. A child was born to royalty in Lumbini, a child who would live for 80 years and whose teachings would spread across continents and persist for millennia. A child who would wrestle with the same questions that haunt us all. Why do we suffer? Is there a way out? What does it mean to truly live? His mother died 7 days after giving birth. This detail, stark and sad, would become relevant later. The boy who would eventually teach about impermanence and the inevitability of loss began his life by losing the woman who brought him into the world. But he wouldn't know about it. Not really. His father, King Suddhodana, made certain of that. Because there had been a prophecy, the king summoned seers and Brahmins to examine the newborn prince. They looked at his body, noting certain marks and features that tradition held as significant. 32 major characteristics, they said. 80 minor ones. This child was destined for greatness, but the nature of that greatness hung in balance. He would become one of 2 things, either a great Chakravartin, a universal monarch who would rule the entire known world with power and righteousness, or he would become a great spiritual teacher, a Buddha who would abandon worldly life to save humanity from suffering. King Suddhodana had his own ideas about which path his son should take. He wanted an heir, a warrior, a king who would extend the Shakya influence and power. The thought of his only son becoming a wandering holy man, begging for food and sleeping under trees, was unbearable. So the king made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He would make sure Siddhartha never had a reason to question life, never had a reason to seek anything beyond the palace walls, never encountered suffering, never saw pain, never witnessed anything that might spark spiritual seeking. And so began the most elaborate exercise in denial that history has recorded. Picture the palace compound. Actually, there were 3 palaces, 1 for each season. Summer palaces, built to catch every breeze. Winter palaces designed to trap warmth. Monsoon palaces, engineered to withstand the torrential rains. Each one was a marvel of architecture and luxury. Gardens that bloomed year-round through careful cultivation. Ponds stocked with exotic fish. pavilions where musicians played day and night. Siddhartha grew up in this gilded world. His aunt, Mahaprajapati, his mother's sister, and his father's second wife, raised him with tender care. She had her own son, Nanda, but tradition says she devoted herself to Siddhartha, nursing him while her own child was cared for by a wet nurse. The entire kingdom seemed to conspire to give this child everything. He learned the arts befitting a prince: archery, swordsmanship, wrestling, swimming. He could ride horses before most children could walk steadily. He studied with Brahmins who taught him Sanskrit and mathematics, poetry, and philosophy. He was trained in statecraft, in the complex rituals and duties of his caste, in everything a future king would need to know. But more than all this, he was shielded. The king's orders were absolute. No old people were allowed where the prince might see them. No sick people, no dead bodies, no funeral processions passing by. Even the gardens were attended to with obsessive care. Any flower that showed signs of wilting was removed before the prince could notice. Servants who showed any sign of aging or illness were quietly reassigned to areas of the palace the prince never visited. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? How do you hide the fundamental nature of existence from someone for nearly 3 decades? But consider how it might work. If you've only ever known youth and health and beauty, you have no context for imagining anything else. If everyone around you is carefully selected and presented, if your world is small enough and controlled enough, you might actually believe that life is an endless parade of pleasant moments, one after another, forever. Siddhartha married young, as was customary for princes of his time. The sources vary on his exact age, with some accounts suggesting 16. Some accounts say he won his bride, Yasodhara, in an archery contest. Others say it was arranged by the families, as was customary. She was beautiful, intelligent, devoted. She came from the same Kshatriya warrior caste, the same social world. They were well matched by every measure that mattered to the people around them. Years passed. The prince matured into a man of remarkable presence. The texts describe him as physically perfect, charismatic, naturally gifted at everything he attempted. He had friends, companions, endless entertainments. Dancing girls performed for him. Musicians composed songs. Poets competed for his attention. He had everything anyone could want, except that somewhere, deep in a place he probably couldn't even name, something was stirring. A question that had no words yet, a dissatisfaction that had no object, the beginning of what would later be called the spiritual quest. Though at this point, it was just a vague unease, easily pushed aside in the rush of pleasure and distraction. When Siddhartha was 29 years old, Yasodhara gave birth to a son. The child was named Rahula, which means fetter or bond. Some versions of the story say that when news of the birth was brought to Siddhartha, that's the word he spoke. A fetter has been formed. Whether he actually said this, or whether it's a later addition to emphasize his growing dissatisfaction with palace life, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that everything was about to change. 29 years of careful control, of orchestrated perfection, of denying reality was about to come undone, because you can't hide the truth forever. Eventually, it finds a way through, the great departure, seeds of discontent. The texts call them the 4 passing sights, and they've become central to Buddhism's origin story. The traditional accounts describe them vividly, though whether they happened exactly as described, whether they occurred over 4 separate journeys, or in some other way, remains a matter of interpretation. What seems clear is that Siddhartha encountered realities his sheltered life had kept from him, and these encounters profoundly shifted his understanding. Siddhartha asked his charioteer, a man named Chana, to take him beyond the palace grounds. Why this day? Why, after 29 years of contentment, did the prince suddenly want to see his father's kingdom? The texts don't really say, and maybe there's no satisfying answer. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Maybe the birth of his son had triggered something. Maybe the not yet Buddha was responding to an intuition he couldn't name, a pull toward truth that was stronger than all the pleasures that surrounded him. They drove out through the gates in a chariot, Siddhartha eager to see the world he'd been kept from. And what he saw changed everything. The first sight was an old man, bent, wrinkled, trembling as he walked, hair white and thin, skin hanging loose, moving slowly, painfully, each step a visible effort. Siddhartha had never seen anything like this. In the palace, everyone was young, or at least appeared so. The filtering had been that complete. "What is wrong with that man?" the prince asked Chana. "He is old, my lord." "Old?" "Yes, he has lived many years. This is what happens to all of us who live long enough." Siddhartha couldn't process this at first. "You mean everyone becomes like that? Even you? Even me?" "Even you, my lord. It is the nature of life. None escape it who live long enough." The second journey brought them face to face with someone ravaged by disease. The details vary in different tellings, but the essence is consistent. A person in the grip of serious illness, body failing, pain evident in every movement. Again, Siddhartha had to ask what he was seeing. Again, the answer was devastating. "This is sickness, my lord. The body breaks down. Disease strikes anyone, regardless of wealth or status or virtue. None are immune." The third journey was perhaps the most shocking of all. A corpse being carried to the burning grounds, mourners wailing and weeping around it, death laid bare, the absolute end of the body, the final destination of everyone born. "This happens to all?" Siddhartha asked. "Yes, my lord. To every person who lives, death comes for everyone. There are no exceptions." Can you imagine the vertigo of this realization? Your entire worldview dissolving in the space of a few days. Every assumption you'd ever made about life revealed as a carefully maintained fiction. Siddhartha returned to the palace after each of these journeys, but he couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. The dancing girls still danced, the musicians still played, the gardens still bloomed. But now, he knew what was hidden beneath it all. The deterioration, the disease, the inevitable ending. Everything he looked at was suddenly tinged with impermanence. His wife would age, his son would age, he himself would age. All of them would sicken. All of them would die. The palace wasn't paradise. It was a beautiful prison where the inmates refused to acknowledge that the walls couldn't keep out time or decay or mortality. The fourth side offered something different, an ascetic, a wandering holy man, walking peacefully along the road with nothing but a begging bowl and simple robes. And here's what struck Siddhartha. The man looked content, not happy in the way palace entertainers forced happiness, but genuinely at peace, serene, free from the kind of grasping and clinging that Siddhartha now recognized in everyone around him, including himself. "Who is that?" he asked Chana. "A holy man, my lord. One who has renounced the world to seek liberation from suffering." Liberation from suffering. The phrase planted itself in Siddhartha's mind and wouldn't leave, because now that he'd seen the truth of old age, sickness, and death, he couldn't stop seeing it. Every pleasure was haunted by its impermanence. Every joy was shadowed by the knowledge that it would end. He was sitting in the middle of luxury, surrounded by everything anyone could want, and he was drowning in existential horror. How can people live like this? He must have wondered. How can they laugh and dance and plan for the future when they must know, that it's all going to end in decrepitude and death? Are they all in denial, or have they found some way to make peace with it that I haven't? The ascetic represented a third option, not denial, not despair, but a path toward understanding, toward liberation. The word itself held promise, not escape exactly. You can't escape aging, sickness, and death. They're built into existence, but perhaps you could be free from the suffering they cause. Free from the fear, the clinging, the desperate attempt to hold on to what can't be held. Siddhartha tried to return to normal life. He attended to his duties. He played with his newborn son. He smiled at his wife. But inside, everything had shifted. The texts say he was like a swan trapped in a net, or a fish caught in a shrinking pool. He couldn't settle, couldn't rest. The question had taken root too deep. Is there a way out of this suffering? And if there is, how do I find it? One night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the palace. The texts paint a scene that feels almost dreamlike in its symbolism. He passed through the quarters where the dancing girls and musicians slept, and saw them as they really were. Not the polished performers they presented during the day, but humans in all their ordinary vulnerability. Mouths hanging open, bodies awkwardly sprawled, some snoring. The masks of beauty and grace discarded in sleep, revealing the simple animal reality underneath. This, the texts suggest, was when Siddhartha truly understood that he had to leave. Not in anger at his father's deception, not in rejection of his family, but out of a desperate need to find answers that the palace couldn't provide. If he stayed, he would become king. He would rule well, probably. He would fulfill every expectation, but he would never be free of the fear and confusion that had seized him since he'd seen what the palace walls had been hiding. So he made a choice that has echoed through history. Late that night, or very early in the morning, depending on how you measure time in the space between darkness and dawn, Prince Siddhartha took one last look at his sleeping wife and child. Some versions say he almost woke them. Some say he touched Rahula's head in farewell. Some say he simply stood in the doorway, memorizing their faces. Then he left. He called for Channa and his favorite horse, Kanthaka. He gathered no possessions, took no provisions. He simply rode out through the palace gates. Later tradition would embellish this departure with miraculous details. But what matters is that Siddhartha left quietly, without confrontation, in the darkness before dawn. They rode until they reached the edge of the forest. There, Siddhartha did something profoundly symbolic. He drew his sword and cut off his hair. Long hair, worn in the elaborate style of royalty, fell to the ground. Then he removed his royal garments and exchanged them with Channa for simple robes. The prince disappeared. In his place stood a wanderer, a seeker, a man with nothing but a question. He sent Channa back with the horse and one message for his father. I haven't left to hurt anyone. I've left to find a way to end suffering. When I've found it, I'll return. Then, Siddhartha walked into the forest alone. Behind him was everything he'd ever known, everything he'd ever been. Ahead was nothing but uncertainty and the slimmest hope that somewhere, someone had found what he was looking for. The way to be free. He was 29 years old. He had no teacher, no map, no plan beyond this. Find the truth, no matter what it costs, no matter how long it takes, the ascetic years, seeking in extremes. The world beyond the palace was nothing like Siddhartha had imagined. Where his father's kingdom had been ordered and controlled, the wider world was chaotic and raw. Where luxury had been abundant, now he had to beg for food, standing with a bowl like any common ascetic, waiting for householders to place a few spoonfuls of rice or dal as an act of merit. The India of the 6th century BCE was going through a period of profound spiritual ferment. The old Vedic religion, with its elaborate rituals and powerful Brahmin priesthood, was being questioned and challenged by new movements. Ascetics and wandering teachers proliferated, each claiming to have found the path to liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Some taught extreme asceticism, others taught philosophical materialism that denied the very existence of anything beyond the material world. Still others taught various forms of meditation and yogic practice. Into this marketplace of spiritual ideas walked the former prince, now just another seeker with a shaved head and a begging bowl. He had no credentials, no recommendation, no status beyond his evident sincerity and the intensity of his quest. But these were the credentials that mattered among the serious seekers of his time. Siddhartha didn't retreat into comfort or give up when he encountered the harshness of homeless wandering. If anything, he threw himself into this new life with the same intensity he'd brought to mastering archery or studying philosophy in the palace. If there was liberation to be found, he would find it. If there were teachers who knew the way, he would learn from them. If practices could lead to freedom, he would master those practices. His first stop was the city of Rajagaha, the capital of Magadha, one of the most powerful kingdoms of the time. He began begging for alms on the streets, moving from house to house with his bowl. Even in simple robes with a shaved head, carrying nothing but a bowl, his presence was remarkable enough that word reached King Bimbisara. There was something about Siddhartha's bearing, the way he moved, the quality of his attention, that set him apart from ordinary beggars and even from other ascetics. The king, intrigued by reports of this noble-looking beggar, sought Siddhartha out personally. When they met, Bimbisara recognized immediately that this was no ordinary wanderer. He offered Siddhartha a position in his court, perhaps even a share of the kingdom, if he would give up this begging life and bring his obvious qualities to the service of Magadha. Here was safety, status, security, not the extreme luxury of the Shakya palace perhaps, but certainly comfort and honor. Siddhartha refused gently but firmly. He explained that he'd left greater luxury than this to seek something more fundamental than political power or material comfort. He was searching for the end of all suffering, for liberation from the entire cycle of birth and death. But he made a promise that the king found intriguing. When I find what I'm looking for, I'll return and teach you. Bimbisara understood, or at least accepted this explanation. He would indeed become one of the Buddha's chief supporters later, but for now, he let the young seeker continue his search. He found his first teacher in a hermit named Alara Kalama, who taught a form of meditation designed to reach what was called the sphere of nothingness. Siddhartha, who had never meditated seriously before, proved to be an extraordinary student. He mastered the techniques quickly, achieving states of concentration that took others years to reach. Alara Kalama was so impressed that he offered to make Siddhartha his co-teacher, equal partners in guiding students. But Siddhartha noticed something. These meditative states, peaceful and refined as they were, didn't solve the fundamental problem. When you came out of meditation, you were still subject to aging, sickness, and death. The deep calm was temporary, a respite rather than a resolution. This wasn't liberation. This was just a very sophisticated form of escape. So he thanked his teacher and moved on. His second teacher was Uddaka Ramaputta, who taught methods for reaching an even subtler state, called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. Again, Siddhartha mastered the practices with remarkable speed. Again, the teacher offered to make him an equal partner. And again, Siddhartha recognized that while these states were interesting, while they represented significant mental attainments, they weren't what he was looking for. They didn't touch the root of suffering. They didn't provide understanding. They were states of mind, temporary and conditioned, not the unconditioned freedom he sought. But if meditation alone wasn't the answer, what was? The prevailing wisdom among serious spiritual seekers at the time pointed toward asceticism. The body, with its appetites and distractions and constant demands, was seen as an obstacle to spiritual realization. The path to truth, many believed, required subduing the flesh, punishing it into submission, weakening its hold on consciousness until the spirit could break free. Siddhartha decided to try this approach with the same wholehearted commitment he brought to everything else. He joined a group of 5 ascetics who practiced extreme austerities in the forest near Uruvela by the Niranjana River. Over the course of about 6 years, he would explore various ascetic practices, eventually pushing himself to extremes that would become legendary. He reduced his food intake to almost nothing. The texts describe extreme deprivation. One account says he ate a single grain of rice per day, another that he survived on the fruits of a single jujube tree. Whether literally accurate or representing the severity of his fasting, his body clearly suffered. He became emaciated. His ribs became visible through his skin. His limbs grew thin and weak. The texts describe his spine being visible through his abdomen, the flesh between them having melted away. The accounts describe various extreme practices, holding his breath until the pain in his head was so intense, it felt like someone was drilling into his skull, sitting in uncomfortable postures for hours, wearing rough clothing that irritated the skin, sleeping on beds of thorns, holding his arms above his head until the muscles weakened, standing in the sun during the hottest part of the day and sitting outside during the coldest nights. Why? Why would someone do this to themselves? The logic, if you can call it that, was simple. The body is the source of desire, and desire is the source of suffering. Therefore, if you can completely master the body, if you can prove to yourself and the universe that you're not controlled by physical appetites, or comfort, or pain, then perhaps you can transcend suffering itself. The 5 ascetics who practiced with Siddhartha were impressed. Here was someone more dedicated than any of them, someone who pushed the limits of endurance further than they'd imagined possible. They began to see him as their leader, the one who would surely achieve liberation through his extreme discipline. But Siddhartha, despite his skeletal frame and iron will, was arriving at a disturbing conclusion. This wasn't working either. The pain was just pain. The hunger was just hunger. Weakening the body didn't strengthen the mind or clarify understanding. If anything, severe asceticism created its own form of distraction. It was hard to investigate the nature of reality when you were constantly preoccupied with the body's suffering. More fundamentally, Siddhartha began to suspect that he'd simply traded one extreme for another. In the palace, he'd indulged every physical pleasure. Now he was denying every physical need. But both approaches were based on the same mistake, believing that manipulating physical experience would solve a problem that wasn't ultimately physical. The tradition preserves a story about this realization, that Siddhartha overheard a music teacher instructing a student, saying that if you tune a string too tight, it will snap, but too loose, and it won't play. The right sound comes from the middle way. Whether this actually happened or represents the essence of his insight, the principle became central to his teaching. Neither indulgence nor denial, neither attachment to pleasure nor attachment to pain. a balanced approach that acknowledged the body's needs without being controlled by them, that used the mind without being lost in mental extremes. Shortly after this realization, a young woman named Sujata approached Siddhartha with an offering of rice milk, a sweet, nourishing food. The texts say she'd been making offerings to a tree spirit, asking for a blessing, and her prayers had been answered. Now she wanted to give thanks, and she mistook the emaciated Siddhartha, sitting beneath a tree, for the spirit itself. Siddhartha accepted the food. He drank the rice milk, feeling strength to return to his starved body. It was, in its way, as significant a moment as leaving the palace had been. He was giving up another form of extremism, another false path, even though it meant disappointing the 5 ascetics who had come to revere his discipline. When they saw him eating, they were disgusted. Siddhartha has given up, they said to each other. He's abandoned the struggle. He's weak. They left him there by the river, convinced that he'd failed in his quest. But Siddhartha knew better. He hadn't given up. He'd learned. Neither luxury nor suffering held the answer. Neither indulgence nor denial led to freedom. The path, if there was one, had to be somewhere else. Somewhere he hadn't looked yet. He was 35 years old. He'd been seeking for 6 years. He tried the most refined meditation techniques the age could offer. He'd pushed asceticism to its absolute limit, and he'd learned that neither approach worked. But instead of despair, Siddhartha felt a strange certainty forming. He was close to something, not because he'd found the answer, but because he'd eliminated the false paths. He'd proven, through his own experience, what liberation wasn't. Now, he was ready to discover what it was. There was one thing left to try. Not a technique he'd learned from anyone, not a method passed down through tradition. Just this: sit down, be still, pay attention to what is, and don't get up until you understand. The night of awakening. Siddhartha walked until he reached a grove near the town of Bodhi. The area was peaceful, sheltered, the kind of place where the world's noise faded to a manageable whisper. There was a large fig tree there, what we now call a peepal or Bodhi tree, with heart-shaped leaves that rustled in the slightest breeze. Later, it would be called the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. But right now, it was just a tree, and Siddhartha was just a man who had tried everything and was ready to try nothing. He found some grass, soft and fresh, and made a simple seat at the tree's base. Then he sat down in what would come to be known as the lotus position, legs crossed, spine straight, hands resting in his lap. The texts say he made a vow: I will not rise from this spot until I have found what I'm looking for. Even if my skin, my nerves, my bones waste away, even if my blood dries up, I will not leave this seat until I've achieved complete awakening. It sounds dramatic, and it was, but it was also the logical conclusion of everything that had come before. He'd tried pleasure, tried pain, tried meditation techniques and ascetic practices and philosophical study. None of it had led to the freedom he sought. Now he was going to stop trying so hard, stop reaching for anything external. Just sit and observe what is actually here, what's actually happening beneath all the concepts and beliefs and methods. What follows is both historical event and spiritual teaching, reality and mythology so intertwined that separating them might miss the point entirely. Because what happened under that tree wasn't just one man's personal awakening. It became the template for how Buddhism understands the path to liberation. So, let's tell it as the tradition tells it, keeping in mind that whether these events occurred literally or symbolically, their meaning remains profound. As Siddhartha settled into meditation, something noticed. We call it Mara, which is often translated as demon or evil one, but is better understood as the personification of everything that keeps beings trapped in delusion and suffering. Mara is temptation, distraction, fear, desire, attachment to existence, resistance to truth. Mara is what we all face when we get close to genuine transformation. First, Mara tried fear. The texts describe armies of demons attacking, horrible creatures with weapons and frightening forms. They shot arrows and threw rocks and came at Siddhartha from every direction. But something had shifted in him. The arrows turned to flowers before they reached him. The weapons became harmless. Fear couldn't find purchase because Siddhartha wasn't defending anything anymore. What could you threaten in someone who'd given up everything? Next, Mara tried desire. He sent his daughters, personifications of different forms of craving and attachment. They were beautiful, seductive, promising pleasure and satisfaction, and all the good feelings that humans chase their entire lives. But Siddhartha had lived in a palace surrounded by beauty. He knew that path led nowhere. The desire arose and passed away, neither pushed aside nor indulged in, simply seen for what it was. Then Mara tried a subtler attack, doubt and pride. He challenged Siddhartha's right to be there, to attempt this awakening. "Who are you?" Mara asked, "to think you can achieve what so few have achieved? What makes you special? Where's your teacher? Who witnesses your efforts? You're alone under a tree, deluded and arrogant, wasting your time." In response, Siddhartha reached down with his right hand and touched the earth. This gesture, which would become one of the most iconic images in Buddhist art, was both simple and profound. "The earth itself is my witness," Siddhartha was saying. "Every step of this journey, every life lived in preparation for this moment, the entire universe has witnessed and supports. I don't need external validation. The truth validates itself." The earth, according to the story, responded with a roar of affirmation, and Mara, defeated, retreated. But the real work was just beginning, because what came next wasn't a battle with external forces, but an investigation into the nature of reality itself. Siddhartha turned his attention inward, but not in a way that shut out the world. Rather, he opened himself to what was actually present, stripping away the layers of assumption and belief and habit that normally color our perception. The texts say he achieved various stages of concentration and insight as the night progressed. In the first watch of the night, he remembered all his previous lives, countless births and deaths stretching back through time. This wasn't just memory, but a direct seeing of the impermanent nature of all existence, the endless cycle of becoming and unbecoming that characterizes conditioned reality. In the second watch, he developed what's called the divine eye, the ability to see how beings come into existence and pass away according to their actions, not as divine judgment, but as natural law. Actions have consequences. Wholesome actions lead to one kind of result, unwholesome actions to another. But all of it, the entire system of karma and rebirth, was still part of the problem, not the solution. In the third watch of the night, as the morning star began to rise, Siddhartha turned his attention to the fundamental question: why is there suffering? What causes it? And is there a way to end it? What he saw was both simple and revolutionary. Suffering exists because of craving, because of the fundamental delusion that we're separate, permanent selves who can find lasting satisfaction in impermanent, changing conditions. We crave pleasure. We crave existence. We crave comfort and security and confirmation. And all of that craving is based on a misunderstanding about what we actually are. Because when Siddhartha looked deeply into the nature of experience, he couldn't find a self, not a soul, not a permanent essence, not anything that could be grasped as me or mine. There were physical processes, mental processes, consciousness arising and passing away moment to moment, but no fixed, unchanging self directing it all. And if there's no permanent self, then what is there to defend? What is there to build up? What is there to fear losing? The entire structure of suffering, built on the foundation of self-concern and self-protection, collapsed when the foundation itself was seen through. This is awakening, not achieving something, but seeing through the illusion that made achievement seem necessary. Not becoming enlightened, but recognizing that the one who thought they needed enlightenment was never really there in the first place. The morning star appeared on the horizon, and Siddhartha Gautama, the seeker, dissolved. In his place sat the Buddha, the one who is awake, not awake to some mystical other realm, but awake to this moment, this breath, this arising and passing away that is all there ever is. The texts suggest that after his enlightenment, the Buddha remained in the vicinity of the Bodhi tree for some weeks, exploring and stabilizing this new understanding. Different accounts give different durations, but what matters is that he spent time integrating what he'd discovered, seeing it from every angle, ensuring it wasn't another form of delusion or temporary state. And what he found was that it held up. The understanding was complete. The search was over. But completing the search raised a new question. Now what? The decision to teach. The Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, and for a moment that stretched beyond time, he simply rested in what he'd realized. The urgency was gone. The seeking was over. He'd found the unconditioned, the deathless, the end of suffering. And paradoxically, having found it, he was free to do nothing. No more striving, no more becoming, no more problems to solve or goals to achieve. But there was something else present too. Something that surprised him, or would have, if surprise was still operating in the usual way. He felt compassion, deep, natural compassion for the countless beings still caught in the web of suffering that he'd just escaped, because that's what understanding does. When you see through your own illusion, you can't help but see that everyone else is suffering from the same mistake. The texts say that the gods Brahma and Indra appeared before the Buddha and begged him to teach. This is how the tradition frames the internal deliberation that likely occurred, should he attempt to share what seemed nearly impossible to communicate. The mythological language captures a real psychological moment of weighing whether teaching was possible or worthwhile. His hesitation was genuine. What he'd realized wasn't a set of concepts or beliefs that could be transmitted through normal communication. It was a direct seeing that fundamentally depended on individual investigation and insight. You can't give someone enlightenment any more than you can give them your experience of the color red. They have to see it for themselves. Moreover, the teaching would be subtle and difficult. Most people were deeply invested in their beliefs about self and reality. They had entire lives built around assumptions that the Buddha had seen through. Trying to explain that the foundation they were building on didn't actually exist, that would be threatening, confusing, likely to be misunderstood or rejected outright. But compassion won out. Or rather, compassion was simply the natural expression of wisdom. If there was even a chance that someone could benefit from hearing the teaching, that someone might use it to investigate their own experience and find the same freedom, then sharing it was the appropriate response. The Buddha thought about who might understand. His first teachers, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, came to mind. They were already far along the path, skilled in meditation, open to deep investigation. but both had died, he somehow knew. They were beyond his help. Then he remembered the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him by the river when he'd given up extreme austerities. They were sincere seekers. They dedicated their lives to liberation, even if their methods were misguided. They might listen, they might understand, and even if they didn't, they deserved to hear what he'd found. So the Buddha got up from beneath the Bodhi tree and started walking. From Bodh Gaya to Sarnath was a considerable journey, perhaps 100 miles or more depending on the road. Not in a straight line, not in a hurry, but moving through the landscape the way a teacher should move through the world, available, present, ready for whatever encounters the journey might bring. Along the way, he met a wandering ascetic named Upaka, who noticed something remarkable about him. There was a quality to the Buddha's presence, a certain radiance or clarity that set him apart. Upaka stopped him and asked, "Friend, who is your teacher? Whose doctrine do you follow?" The Buddha replied that he had no teacher, that he'd achieved enlightenment on his own, that he was without equal in the world. It could sound arrogant, except it was simply true. Not ego making a claim, but reality stating what is. Upaka, not ready to hear this, shook his head and walked away. The texts note this with a kind of gentle sadness. The first person to hear the Buddha's teaching after his awakening couldn't accept it, but the Buddha continued walking. Eventually, he reached the deer park at Sarnath, just outside the ancient city of Benares, now called Varanasi. It was a peaceful place, used by ascetics and contemplatives as a retreat spot. And there he found the 5 who had left him. When they saw him approaching, their first instinct was to maintain their distance. "This is the one who gave up," they reminded each other. "He abandoned the path. We shouldn't pay him any respect or stand when he arrives. Let's treat him as what he is, a failed ascetic, not worthy of our attention." But as the Buddha came closer, something happened. They couldn't maintain their resolve. Without deciding to, they found themselves standing. One brought water for washing, another brought a seat, a third took his bowl. They were responding to something they couldn't name, a quality of presence that bypassed their judgments and opinions. The Buddha sat down among them. They addressed him as Friend Gautama, maintaining a pretense of equality or perhaps superiority. But he corrected them gently. "Don't call me friend," he said. "I am not what I was. I have achieved complete enlightenment. I am a Tathagata, one who has gone thus, who has found the way beyond suffering." They were skeptical. "You couldn't do it with those extreme practices," they said. "How could you have done it by giving them up? How could eating and resting and being moderate lead to what severe discipline could not?" The Buddha didn't argue. He simply offered to teach them. "Listen carefully," he said. "I have found the deathless. I will instruct you. If you practice as I teach, you will realize for yourselves what I have realized. You will see the end of suffering." Something in his voice, in his entire being, convinced them to listen. Maybe it was his certainty. Maybe it was the peace that radiated from him. Maybe it was just the fact that they'd been seeking for so long, and here was someone claiming to have found what they were looking for. Whatever the reason, they agreed to hear him out. According to Buddhist tradition, this occurred about 7 weeks after his enlightenment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the deer park. The Buddha settled into his seat, gathering his thoughts for what would be remembered as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the first teaching that would eventually spread across continents and down through centuries, adapted and interpreted and practiced in 1,000 different ways, but always pointing back to this moment, to this man who had gone from prince to beggar to ascetic to something beyond all categories. to this voice about to speak truths that would change the world. Turning the wheel, the first sermon. Picture the scene as the tradition describes it, the deer park at Sarnath, a place where animals grazed peacefully and ascetics came to practice, away from the noise of the city. The sun has set, leaving that particular quality of light that exists between day and night, when the world seems to pause and pay attention. 5 ascetics sit in a semicircle, their initial skepticism tempered by curiosity, by something they can't quite name in this man they used to know. The Buddha begins by establishing what would become central to his teaching, the middle way. Neither indulgence nor denial, neither attachment to pleasure nor attachment to pain. He speaks from his own experience, describing how he tried both extremes and found them wanting. This isn't philosophy or theory. This is the testimony of someone who has walked both paths and found a third. Then, he introduces what would become known as the 4 Noble Truths. Not truths in the sense of dogmas to be believed, but truths to be verified through direct experience. Noble because they're the truths that liberate, that lead to freedom when fully understood. The first noble truth is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but the word means something more subtle. Unsatisfactoriness, the quality of stress and dissatisfaction that pervades conditioned existence. Birth is dukkha, the trauma and vulnerability of entering the world helpless and dependent. Aging is dukkha, watching the body slowly deteriorate, losing capabilities you once took for granted. Sickness is dukkha, the pain and fear and disruption that comes with illness. Death is dukkha, the ultimate ending that none can avoid. Being separated from what you love is dukkha, the pain of loss that eventually visits every attachment. Being stuck with what you hate is dukkha, forced proximity to unpleasant people or situations. Not getting what you want is dukkha, the constant disappointment of unmet desires. Even getting what you want is dukkha because it's impermanent and will eventually be lost. And even while you have it, there's the fear and anxiety of potential loss. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. The Buddha isn't saying that life contains no pleasure or happiness. He's saying that all pleasure and happiness in conditioned existence is temporary, unstable, ultimately unable to provide lasting satisfaction. Because everything changes, everything passes away. Building your happiness on conditions that are constantly shifting is like building a house on sand. It might stand for a while, might even look solid and permanent, but eventually the foundation shifts and the whole structure comes down. The Buddha wasn't denying the existence of good experiences. He'd had plenty of them himself, both in the palace and after his awakening. But he was pointing out that even the best experiences in conditioned reality share this characteristic of dukkha. They arise dependent on causes and conditions, and when those causes and conditions change, the experiences end. The sweetest pleasure contains within it the seed of future pain, because you know or suspect that it won't last. The most profound joy is tinged with the awareness of its impermanence. The second noble truth identifies the cause of dukkha, craving or thirst, called tanha in Pali. Not just craving for pleasant experiences, though that's part of it, but also craving for existence itself, the deep-seated desire to continue being, to maintain and protect and expand the self, and even craving for non-existence, the impulse to escape or annihilate when experience becomes too painful. Some people spend their lives chasing pleasure, others running from pain, others swinging between the two. But all of it is driven by craving, by the fundamental assumption that if we could just arrange conditions correctly, we'd finally be satisfied. All this craving is rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding. We crave because we believe that satisfying the craving will make us complete. will solve the problem of dukkha, but craving itself is the problem. It's like drinking salt water to quench thirst. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. The more you chase satisfaction through craving, the more dissatisfied you feel. Why? Because craving is based on the illusion of a separate, permanent self that can be satisfied. We think, if I can just get this thing, achieve this goal, become this person, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be complete. But the self we're trying to satisfy doesn't exist in the way we think it does. It's not a solid, unchanging entity. It's a process, constantly changing, dependently arising. So we're trying to satisfy something that isn't even there in the way we imagine. And this leads into deeper territory that the Buddha explored thoroughly. Not only is the craving based on illusion, but it perpetuates itself. Each time we crave something and satisfy the craving temporarily, we reinforce the pattern. We teach ourselves that craving leads to satisfaction, even though the satisfaction never lasts. So we crave again and again and again. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. We become addicted to our own patterns of wanting and grasping, even as those very patterns create the dissatisfaction we're trying to escape. The third noble truth offers hope. There is an end to dukkha. It's possible to experience complete cessation of this cycle of craving and suffering, not by achieving something or becoming someone, but by seeing through the illusion that creates the problem in the first place. This cessation, called nibbana in Pali, nirvana in Sanskrit, is not extinction or annihilation. It's the ending of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's what remains when you stop creating suffering. The Buddha described nirvana in various ways, often in negative terms, what it isn't rather than what it is. Because it transcends ordinary conditioned experience, language struggles to capture it. It's unconditioned, meaning it doesn't depend on causes and conditions, like everything else in our experience. It's deathless, meaning it's not subject to birth and decay, like conditioned phenomena. It's the end of becoming, the cessation of the endless process of coming into being and passing away. It's peace, calm, refuge, the far shore beyond the ocean of suffering. But the Buddha was also clear that nirvana isn't something that exists in another realm or time. It's available right here, right now, to anyone who realizes it. It's not that you go somewhere else or become someone else. It's that you see through the illusion of the separate self and the craving that sustains it. When that illusion is fully penetrated, what remains is nirvana, not as an achievement or attainment, but as what was always already there, obscured by ignorance and craving. The fourth noble truth lays out the path to this cessation, the noble Eightfold Path. 8 aspects of practice that support and reinforce each other, creating conditions for wisdom to arise. Not steps to be followed sequentially, but dimensions of a whole way of living. Right view is seeing reality as it actually is, not as we wish it were or fear it might be. It's understanding impermanence, understanding dukkha, understanding that there is no permanent self. Right view isn't about believing the right things. It's about seeing clearly. Right intention is the quality of mind that orients toward liberation rather than entanglement. It's the intention to renounce craving, to develop goodwill and compassion rather than ill will, and to embrace harmlessness rather than harmfulness. Intention shapes the direction of practice. Right speech is using words skillfully, avoiding lying, divisive speech, harsh words, and idle chatter. This isn't about rigid rules, but about recognizing that speech has power. Words can heal or harm, clarify or confuse, bring people together or drive them apart. Right speech is being mindful of this power. Right action is behaving in ways that don't cause harm to ourselves or others. The traditional formulation includes not killing, not stealing, and not engaging in sexual misconduct. But more broadly, it's about aligning our actions with our deepest understanding, rather than acting from habit or impulse. Right livelihood extends right action into how we make a living. Don't earn your living through activities that cause harm, like trading in weapons, living beings, meat, intoxicants, or poisons. More generally, find work that doesn't require you to compromise your values or harm others. Right effort is the quality of energy and persistence in practice, not straining or forcing, but maintaining consistent engagement. It means preventing unwholesome states from arising, abandoning those that have arisen, cultivating wholesome states, and maintaining those that have been cultivated. It's the engine that powers the path. Right mindfulness is paying attention to what's actually happening in experience, being aware of the body, feelings, mental states, and mental objects as they arise and pass away, not getting lost in thought or caught up in reaction, but maintaining clear awareness of what is. Right. Concentration is the quality of stable, unified attention that comes from meditation practice, not zoning out or dissociating, but gathering the scattered energies of mind into focused awareness. This concentration becomes the tool for investigating reality and seeing through delusion. The Buddha explained how these 8 factors work together. They're often grouped into 3 trainings: ethical conduct, including speech, action, and livelihood; mental discipline, including effort, mindfulness, and concentration; and wisdom, including view and intention. Each training supports the others. Ethics creates the conditions for mental development. Mental development creates the conditions for wisdom. And wisdom deepens ethical behavior and strengthens meditation. But the teaching wasn't abstract. The Buddha kept bringing it back to direct experience. You can verify all of this yourselves, he said. Don't just believe what I'm telling you. Practice and see. Investigate your own experience. Is there a permanent self to be found, or just changing processes? Does craving lead to satisfaction, or more craving? What happens when you let go? As he spoke, something remarkable happened. Kondanya, one of the 5 ascetics, suddenly understood. The texts describe it as the arising of the Dharma eye, the direct seeing of truth that can't be conveyed in words. Later, Kondanya would summarize what he realized in a single phrase. Whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. Simple words, but they contained everything. All conditioned phenomena are impermanent. All of them arise and pass away. Therefore, clinging to any of them as a source of lasting satisfaction is futile. The Buddha saw this understanding arise in Kondanya and exclaimed, "Kondanya knows! Kondanya knows!" It was the first confirmation that the teaching could be transmitted, that others could realize what he had realized. Over the following days, the Buddha taught the other 4 ascetics. One by one, they achieved the same breakthrough. They became arahants, fully awakened beings, free from the cycle of rebirth and suffering, and in doing so, they became the first members of what would be called the Sangha, the community of practitioners. Along with the Buddha, the awakened teacher, and the Dhamma, the teaching itself, the Sangha completed what Buddhists call the triple gem, the 3 refuges that define the Buddhist path. The wheel of Dharma had begun to turn. What had been discovered under a tree in Bodh Gaya was now being shared, transmitted, put into practice by others. The teaching was no longer just one man's private realization. It was becoming a path that anyone could walk, 45 years of teaching. After the first 5 disciples awakened, the Buddha might have stopped. Mission accomplished. The teaching had been tested and proven effective. He could have spent the rest of his life in quiet meditation, enjoying the peace of liberation. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Buddha spent the next 45 years walking the dusty roads of northern India, teaching anyone who would listen. Kings and beggars, priests and prostitutes, scholars and illiterates. He didn't discriminate. If someone genuinely wanted to understand, he would teach them. The Sangha grew quickly. Young men from various castes and backgrounds joined, attracted by the teaching, or by the Buddha's presence, or simply by the promise of a meaningful life. They shaved their heads, put on simple robes, and took up the wandering life, begging for alms and practicing the Dharma. This was radical for the time. The Buddha accepted people regardless of their birth caste, which challenged the entire social structure of Vedic society. He taught that liberation didn't depend on birth or ritual or the favor of gods, but on one's own effort and understanding. A Brahmin priest had no inherent advantage over a street sweeper. Everyone had the same potential to awaken. The Buddha developed a teaching style that was remarkably skillful. He didn't give the same sermon to everyone. Instead, he sized up his audience and taught accordingly. To someone attached to ritual and ceremony, he might emphasize ethics and gradual practice. To someone already deeply familiar with meditation, he might point directly at the most subtle aspects of delusion. To someone who thought they understood but didn't, he might use paradox or silence. He had different approaches for different temperaments. Some people responded to logical argument and systematic explanation. For them, he would lay out the path in clear, sequential steps, showing how each practice built on the previous one. Others needed stories and metaphors, ways to understand abstract truths through concrete images. To them, he spoke in parables, using everyday experiences to illuminate profound insights. There were those who came seeking magic or supernatural powers. The Buddha would acknowledge that such abilities could develop through deep meditation, but he warned against getting distracted by them. They're not the point, he'd say. They don't lead to liberation. They can actually become obstacles if you start using them to impress people or gain status. Focus on ending suffering, not on developing flashy abilities. Some students needed firm correction. They'd come with wrong views, convinced they'd figured everything out, ready to argue and prove themselves right. The Buddha could be sharp with these students, cutting through their pretensions with questions they couldn't answer, pointing out the logical flaws in their reasoning. But it was never cruelty. It was surgical precision, removing the infected tissue of wrong understanding so that healing could begin. Others needed encouragement. They'd be practicing diligently, but doubting themselves, convinced they were making no progress or doing everything wrong. To them, the Buddha was gentle and reassuring. You're on the path, he'd say. Trust the process. Don't be so quick to judge your own practice. Understanding develops gradually, then suddenly. Keep going. His encounters became famous in Buddhist literature. The tradition tells of Angulimala, a murderer who wore a necklace of his victim's fingers, whom the Buddha not only tamed, but converted into a monk who achieved awakening. According to the story, Angulimala was chasing the Buddha, trying to kill him and add his finger to the collection. But no matter how fast Angulimala ran, he couldn't catch the Buddha, who seemed to be simply walking at a normal pace. Exhausted and bewildered, Angulimala called out, "Stop, ascetic." The Buddha replied, "I have stopped. It's you who haven't stopped." This paradoxical exchange broke through Angulimala's murderous rage, and he eventually became a devoted monk, though he struggled with the guilt of his past actions until he achieved awakening. There was Kisa Gotami. a mother driven mad by grief over her dead child. The Buddha's response, as the texts tell it, was to send her to find a mustard seed from a house that had never known death. She carried her child's body from house to house, asking for the seed. At each house, people offered her seeds gladly, but when she asked if anyone in the household had died, every family had lost someone. A parent, a child, a spouse, a grandparent. Death had touched every home. When she realized that loss was universal, that grief was part of the human condition rather than her personal curse, her madness lifted, and she could finally let go of her child's body and begin to grieve properly. There were countless other encounters. The arrogant Brahmin who came to insult the Buddha and ended up sitting at his feet, weeping. The courtesan who donated her pleasure grove to become a monastery. The general who wanted to know if there was ethical warfare. The businessman who asked if it was possible to be wealthy and enlightened. The young monk who kept falling asleep during meditation. The old monk who couldn't remember the teachings. Each person received exactly what they needed, whether it was comfort or challenge, technical instruction or profound pointing. There was Rahula, his own son, who eventually became a monk and student. The reunion between father and son is recorded only briefly in the text, but we can imagine the complexity. Siddhartha had left when Rahula was a newborn. Now the boy was grown, perhaps in his teens or early 20s, and his father was the Buddha, surrounded by hundreds of disciples. What was that first meeting like? Did Rahula feel abandoned? Did he understand why his father had left? The texts don't linger on the emotional dimension, but they record that Rahula became a dedicated practitioner and that the Buddha taught him with particular care, neither showing favoritism nor withholding instruction. He taught Rahula the same truths he taught everyone else, perhaps more carefully because the stakes were personal. If his own son couldn't realize the path, what did that say about the teaching? Yasodhara, his former wife, also appears in the story. When the Buddha returned to Kapilavastu after his enlightenment, she's said to have been the only one who didn't come out to greet him. The other women of the palace went to see this prince-turned-teacher, but Yasodhara stayed in her quarters. Finally, King Suddhodana went to the Buddha and said, "My daughter-in-law has been faithful to you even in your absence. She heard you shaved your head, so she shaved hers. She heard you ate one meal a day, so she did the same. She heard you gave up sleeping on high beds, so she slept on the ground. She's mourned your leaving every day for years. Won't you go to her?" So the Buddha went to her chambers. When Yasodhara saw him, she broke down, weeping, clasping his feet. The Buddha sat with her, letting her grief exhaust itself, then spoke to her gently about impermanence and change. She's said to have become a nun when the Buddha finally allowed women to ordain, though this happened only after considerable persuasion from his stepmother, Mahaprajapati, and his attendant, Ananda. The Buddha's initial reluctance wasn't about women being less capable of awakening. He made clear that women and men had equal potential for realization, but about concerns that including women in the monastic order might create social complications that would threaten the Sangha's survival. In the deeply patriarchal society of ancient India, having women renounce their families and wander as homeless ascetics was scandalous. But Mahaprajapati, who had raised the Buddha as her own son after his mother died, was persistent. She shaved her head, put on robes, and walked to where the Buddha was staying, arriving footsore and covered in dust. When Ananda saw her and learned what she wanted, he pleaded her case to the Buddha. Eventually, the Buddha relented. Women were accepted into the order under the same principles of equality and liberation that govern the men's community, though with additional rules aimed at protecting both the nuns and the order's reputation. King Bimbisara, who had offered Siddhartha a share of his kingdom years earlier, became one of the Buddha's chief supporters. He donated a bamboo grove outside Rajagaha for use as a monastery, giving the Sangha their first permanent residence. Other wealthy supporters followed, building monasteries and supporting the monks with food and supplies. This created a symbiotic relationship. Householders gained merit and teaching by supporting monasters, and monastics gained the material support they needed to focus on practice. The Buddha's own father, King Suddhodana, eventually heard that his son had achieved enlightenment and was teaching nearby. He sent messengers inviting the Buddha to return home. The first 9 delegations of messengers ended up becoming monks and forgetting their mission. The 10th delegation, led by Kaludai, a childhood friend, successfully delivered the invitation, and the Buddha agreed to return. The homecoming must have been extraordinary. The Buddha walked into Kapilavastu, the city he'd left as a prince, now returning as a wandering teacher with a group of bhikkhu followers. His father arranged a great reception at the palace, but the Buddha and his monks went on their alms round through the city first, following their practice of begging for food. King Suddhodana was shocked and offended. No one in the warrior lineage of their family had ever begged for food. The Buddha reportedly responded that begging for alms wasn't the custom of his father's royal lineage, but it was the custom of his lineage as a Buddha. He'd exchanged one inheritance for another. Through all these years, the Buddha maintained a rigorous schedule. During the rainy season, when travel was difficult, the monastics would stay in one place for a 3-month retreat. The rest of the year, they wandered, teaching and practicing. The Buddha himself walked thousands of miles, visiting the same towns and cities repeatedly, building relationships, correcting misunderstandings, deepening the practice of established students while introducing new ones to the path. He dealt with internal conflicts within the Sangha, establishing rules and guidelines that would eventually be codified as the Vinaya, the monastic code of conduct. He addressed challenges from rival teachers who tried to discredit him or lure away his students. He navigated the complex politics of the various kingdoms he passed through, maintaining good relationships with rulers without becoming entangled in their conflicts. And always, he taught the same essential message in 1,000 different forms. Life as we normally experience it is unsatisfactory because we're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. We think we're solid, separate, permanent selves who can find lasting happiness by controlling our experience. But experience is impermanent. Selfhood is an illusion, and the attempt to control actually creates the suffering we're trying to escape. The way out is through seeing clearly, through developing ethics that create peace rather than conflict, concentration that stabilizes the mind, and wisdom that penetrates the illusion of self, through letting go rather than grasping, through understanding rather than believing. 45 years of walking and teaching and pointing the way, not claiming to save anyone. The Buddha was clear that he couldn't do the work for others, but showing them how to save themselves. Being a lamp, as he would later say in his final teaching. A lamp that could light other lamps without being diminished. As the years passed, the Buddha grew old. The body that had been so perfectly conditioned, that had survived extreme asceticism and intense practice, began to show the wear of 8 decades and countless miles. His back hurt, his steps slowed, but his mind remained clear, his teaching sharp, his compassion undiminished. And then came the time when even the Buddha had to face what he'd spent his life teaching others to understand, that all compounded things are subject to decay, that nothing conditioned lasts forever, that even a perfectly enlightened human being dies. The final journey. At 80 years old, the Buddha was still teaching, still walking the roads he'd walked for decades. but his body was giving out. The texts describe various ailments and a general weakness that even his considerable equanimity couldn't completely overcome. He knew what was happening. He'd seen it countless times in others. Now it was his turn. During what would be his last rainy season retreat, the Buddha fell seriously ill. Ananda, his devoted attendant who had served him for 20 years, was terrified. But the Buddha reassured him. "I've taught everything I know," he said. "There's nothing I've held back, no secret teaching reserved only for a special few. I've given you the Dharma and the Vinaya. After I'm gone, let them be your teacher." When he recovered somewhat from that initial illness, the Buddha decided to make one final journey. He wanted to reach Kushinaga, a small town of the Mala people, though he didn't explain why. He simply began walking, with Ananda and a group of monks accompanying him. Along the way, they stopped at Vesali, where a courtesan named Ambapali offered the Buddha and his monks a meal and donated her mango grove to the Sangha. They continued to the village of Pava, where a blacksmith named Konda, overjoyed to host the Buddha, prepared a special meal. The exact nature of this meal is debated in the texts, with various interpretations of the Pali term used, but whatever it was, it made the Buddha severely ill. Some scholars suggest it may have been contaminated pork or mushrooms, though certainty is impossible at this distance. He knew immediately that this was it, the final illness, the one the body wouldn't recover from. But he insisted that Ananda tell Kunda that this meal was especially meritorious, equal to the meal he'd eaten before his enlightenment. He didn't want Kunda to feel guilt or regret for innocently offering food that happened to trigger the Buddha's death. They continued toward Kushinaga, but the Buddha had to stop frequently to rest. At one point, he sent Ananda to fetch water from a stream, even though Ananda protested that a cart had just crossed it and stirred up the mud. When Ananda returned with clear water from a different source, the Buddha drank, then lay down to rest on the ground. A wandering ascetic named Pukusa encountered them and was so moved by the Buddha's calm, despite obvious suffering, that he offered 2 golden-colored robes. The Buddha accepted one for himself and one for Ananda. When the robes were placed on the Buddha, they seemed to lose their luster. Ananda remarked on this, and the Buddha explained that there are 2 occasions when the skin of a Tathagata becomes exceptionally radiant: the night of enlightenment and the night of the final passing away. They reached a grove of sala trees near Kushinaga. The Buddha asked Ananda to prepare a bed for him between 2 of the trees, with his head pointing north. Ananda, trying to hold himself together, arranged the space as requested. The Buddha lay down on his right side in what's called the lion's posture, one hand supporting his head, the other resting along his body. Word spread quickly that the Buddha was dying. Monks hurried to the grove. The local Mala people came to pay respects. The texts describe even gods and spirits gathering to witness this momentous event, creating such a celestial congregation that the texts say the earth itself groaned, a poetic way of expressing the significance of what was occurring. Through all of this, the Buddha remained conscious and teaching. When Ananda broke down weeping, the Buddha comforted him. "You've served me well," he said. "You've been devoted and kind. Don't grieve. Haven't I taught that we must be separated from everything we love? All things that arise must pass away. You're close to awakening yourself. Keep practicing with diligence." A wandering ascetic named Siddhartha arrived, wanting to ask the Buddha questions about conflicting religious teachings. The other monks tried to turn him away, thinking the Buddha should be left in peace. But the Buddha heard and invited Siddhartha to approach. He answered Siddhartha's question so clearly that the man requested ordination on the spot. The Buddha agreed, and Siddhartha became the Buddha's final disciple. By morning, he had achieved awakening. The Buddha then asked his monks 3 times if they had any doubts or questions about his teaching. 3 times, they remained silent. Either they had no questions, or they were too grief-stricken to speak. Finally satisfied that he'd done all he could, the Buddha spoke his last words. The translations vary slightly, but the meaning is clear. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive with diligence for your own liberation. Then, according to the text, the Buddha entered progressively deeper states of meditation. First jhana, second, third, fourth, then beyond, form entirely into the formless realms. Then, he reversed the process, moving back through each stage until he reached the 4th jhana again. From there, he passed away, parinirvana, the final nirvana. Not the extinction of consciousness, Buddhists would later clarify, but the end of all attachment to conditioned existence, what remains when all becoming ceases. The unconditioned, the deathless, not something that can be described, only realized. The earth shook. According to the texts, a great earthquake marked the moment, and even hardened warriors who witnessed it were moved to tears. The monks who had achieved awakening remained calm, understanding that this was simply the nature of all things. But Ananda and others who hadn't yet fully realized the teaching wept openly. For 6 days, the Buddha's body lay in state while preparations were made. The malas wanted to honor him properly, and messengers were sent to notify distant disciples. When everything was ready, the body was carried in procession through Kushinagar, with mourners offering flowers, incense, and music. The cremation site was prepared. The body was placed on a funeral pyre made of fragrant woods. According to tradition, when they tried to light it, the fire wouldn't catch, and this was interpreted as the pyre waiting for Mahakassapa, one of the Buddha's foremost disciples, to arrive from his travels and pay his respects. When Mahakassapa finally arrived and bowed to the Buddha's feet, the texts say, the pyre spontaneously ignited. The fire burned completely, leaving only bones, which are called relics. These were gathered carefully and divided among 8 different groups who had claimed them. Each group built a stupa, a memorial mound, to house their share. Later, about 250 years after the Buddha's death, Emperor Ashoka would have many of these relics disinterred and redistributed among thousands of stupas he built across India, spreading the Buddha's presence symbolically across the land. But the Buddha himself had been clear about this. Don't spend too much energy on my remains, he'd said. Practice the teaching. That's the real way to honor me. The body is just matter, subject to the same decay as everything else. What matters is the Dharma, the truth, the path. That's what should be preserved and transmitted. Legacy and eternal stillness. 2,500 years later, give or take depending on how we date the Buddha's life, we're still talking about a man who sat under a tree and paid attention. Millions of people across the world identify as Buddhist, following various schools and traditions that evolved from what the Buddha taught in those final 45 years of his life. Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia, maintaining the earliest teachings in the Pali Canon, emphasizing individual liberation through meditation and ethical living. Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia, expanding on the original teachings with new scriptures and practices, introducing the bodhisattva ideal of delaying one's own final liberation to help all beings. Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet and Mongolia, incorporating tantric practices and elaborate ritual, using visualization and mantra as skillful means to accelerate the path. Zen in Japan, emphasizing direct transmission outside the scriptures and sudden awakening through intensive meditation. Pure Land Buddhism focusing on devotion and faith in Amitabha Buddha, offering a path accessible to ordinary people caught up in worldly affairs. Each tradition has its own flavor, its own emphasis, its own cultural adaptations. Theravada monks, in their orange robes, walking barefoot through the streets of Bangkok, or Yangon, on their morning alms rounds. Mahayana temples in China and Korea, with their ornate architecture and intricate rituals. Tibetan monks, in maroon and gold, debating Buddhist philosophy in monastery courtyards, or creating elaborate sand mandalas that will be destroyed as soon as they're completed. Japanese Zen practitioners sitting in stark simplicity, facing white walls, just breathing, just being present. Pure Land practitioners chanting the name of Amitabha Buddha with complete devotion and faith. The variations are vast. Some traditions emphasize meditation as the primary path, others devotion and ritual, still others philosophical study and debate. Some are austere and minimalist, others elaborate and visually rich. Some insist on monastic renunciation, others welcome lay practitioners fully into the community. Some see enlightenment as the result of gradual development over many lifetimes. Others point to the possibility of sudden awakening in this very life. But they all trace back to that same source: a prince who left his palace, an ascetic who pushed his body to the limit, a seeker who sat down and refused to get up until he understood, a teacher who walked the roads of India, sharing what he'd found. They all recognize the Four Noble Truths as foundational. They all teach some version of the Eightfold Path. They all point to impermanence, to the absence of a permanent self, to the possibility of liberation from suffering. The specific methods and emphases may differ, but the core insights remain remarkably consistent. What is it about this story, this teaching, that continues to resonate? Maybe it's the radicalism of it. The Buddha didn't claim to be a god or a prophet, or even particularly special. He was just a human being who figured something out through his own effort and investigation. And he said, explicitly, that anyone could do the same. You have the same potential I have, he taught. You can verify everything I've said through your own experience. Don't believe me because I'm the Buddha. Investigate for yourselves. Be your own lamp. This empirical approach to spirituality was revolutionary and remains compelling. The Buddha wasn't asking for faith in the supernatural or acceptance of dogma. He was offering a method. Try this practice. See what happens. If it doesn't work, try something else. But if it does work, if you start to see through suffering and find genuine peace, then keep going. He compared his teaching to a raft used to cross a river. Once you've reached the far shore, you don't need to carry the raft with you. The teaching is a means, not an end. Use it to achieve liberation. Then, let go of even the teaching itself. This pragmatic, non-dogmatic quality has allowed Buddhism to adapt to radically different cultures without losing its essential character. It spread from India to Sri Lanka, to Southeast Asia, to China, to Tibet, to Japan, to Korea, to Mongolia. In each place, it encountered existing belief systems, cultural practices, philosophical frameworks. And rather than demanding wholesale replacement, Buddhism generally integrated with what it found. Buddhist monks in China incorporated Confucian ethics and Taoist cosmology. Buddhism in Tibet merged with the indigenous Bon religion. Buddhism in Japan blended with Shinto. The core teachings remained, but they were expressed through local cultural forms, made relevant to local concerns. In our own time, Buddhism has spread to the West, and once again, it's adapting. Western Buddhists tend to emphasize meditation practice over ritual, Personal experience over traditional authority, psychological insight over cosmological speculation. Mindfulness meditation, derived from Buddhist practices, but often taught in secular contexts, has become mainstream in psychology, medicine, education, business. People who would never identify as Buddhist practice. Meditation for stress reduction, improved focus, emotional regulation. The practices work, whether you believe in rebirth or not, whether you consider yourself religious or not. The core insights haven't aged. We still crave and cling. We still build elaborate structures of self and spend enormous energy defending them. We still chase after pleasures that don't satisfy and run from pains that we make worse by running. We still suffer because we don't understand the nature of our own experience. Look at our modern world. We have technologies the Buddha couldn't have imagined, comforts and conveniences beyond anything available in ancient India. We can communicate instantly across continents. We have medicines that cure diseases that were once death sentences. We have enough food that starvation is less common than obesity in many parts of the world. We have entertainment available 24 hours a day, infinite choices for how to spend our time and attention. And yet, we're not notably happier than people were 2,500 years ago. If anything, rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide suggest we might be less happy despite our material abundance. Why? Because the fundamental problem the Buddha identified hasn't changed. We're still caught in craving, still trying to build permanent satisfaction out of impermanent conditions, still suffering from the gap between how we want things to be and how they actually are. The Buddha would recognize our struggles immediately. The details have changed. Our ancestors craved physical comfort and security. We crave status updates and dopamine hits from social media. But the underlying pattern is identical. We're still drinking that salt water, still convinced that the next thing we acquire or achieve or become will finally make us complete. And the path the Buddha taught still works. Millions of practitioners over centuries have verified this. Develop ethical behavior that creates peace rather than conflict. Cultivate concentration that stabilizes and clarifies the mind. Investigate experience directly to see through the illusion of self, not as a belief system, but as a practical program of training. Not as something to accept on faith, but as something to test and verify in your own life. What's remarkable is how little the Buddha asked people to accept on faith. He didn't require belief in his enlightenment, though he claimed it. He didn't require belief in rebirth, though he taught about it. He didn't require belief in karma or cosmology or any of the elaborate metaphysical systems that existed in his time or developed later. He just said, if you want to end suffering, here's how. The rest is optional. This minimalism, this focus on what's essential, is part of why Buddhism has adapted so successfully to different cultures. You can be a Buddhist without believing in gods. You can be a Buddhist while maintaining your existing religious identity. Buddhist meditation has been adopted by psychologists, neuroscientists, business executives, people who would never identify as Buddhist, but who find value in the practices. The Buddha himself might have approved. He was famously pragmatic. There's a story about a monk who came to him with metaphysical questions. Does the universe have a beginning? Does the enlightened one exist after death? The Buddha responded with his own question. If you were shot with a poison arrow, would you refuse treatment until you knew who shot it, what kind of wood the arrow was made from, and what the shooter's intentions were? Or would you pull out the arrow and treat the wound? The monk admitted he'd deal with the arrow first. Exactly, said the Buddha. I teach the end of suffering. Everything else is beside the point. But alongside this pragmatism was profound compassion. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching when he could have simply enjoyed his own liberation. He established a community that would preserve and transmit the teaching. He created systems and structures that would allow the Dharma to survive beyond his lifetime. He was thinking not just about the people in front of him, but about future generations who might benefit from what he'd discovered. And here we are, part of that future he was thinking about, reading his story, practicing his methods, or at least considering them. The Buddha never wrote anything down himself. Everything we have comes from oral transmission, later written in texts that were inevitably shaped by the cultures and times they passed through. Scholars debate what's historical and what's mythological, what the Buddha actually said and what was added later. But maybe that's not the most important question. Maybe what matters is whether the teaching works. Does it help people suffer less? Does it lead to genuine insight and freedom? Does it make the world a little less painful, a little more compassionate? Millions of practitioners across centuries and cultures would say yes. They've sat in meditation halls and temples and their own homes, following breath, observing thoughts, investigating experience. Some have achieved dramatic breakthroughs, others have experienced subtle shifts in perspective. Still others practice simply because it makes life more bearable, more meaningful. The Buddha's final instruction was to be a lamp unto yourself, not to follow him blindly, but to use his teaching as a guide while trusting your own experience, to investigate, to question, to verify, to find your own way to the same freedom he found. This, perhaps, is the real legacy, not a religion to belong to or a set of beliefs to hold, but a method of investigation, a way of paying attention to what's actually happening in experience instead of getting lost in concepts and beliefs about experience. A path from suffering to freedom that anyone can walk, regardless of background or belief or circumstances. The prince who had everything gave it all up. The seeker who tried every method found that none of them worked as advertised. The ascetic who nearly killed himself learned that the body isn't the enemy. The man who sat under a tree discovered something that no amount of luxury or denial or achievement could provide. And the teacher who walked the roads of India for 45 years showed countless others the same path. He's been gone for 2.5 millennia, but the teaching remains. The method works. The path is still there, waiting for anyone who's ready to walk it. Maybe you're lying here in the dark, listening to this story, because some part of you recognizes what the young prince recognized when he saw old age, sickness, and death for the first time. That something's not quite right, that the surface of life hides a deeper truth, that there must be more than this endless cycle of craving and satisfaction and disappointment and more craving. The Buddha would tell you that yes, there is more, or rather there's less suffering when you see through the illusion, less fear when you understand impermanence, less anxiety when you let go of the imaginary self you've been trying so hard to protect and defend and improve. It's not easy. The path requires genuine effort, consistent practice, willingness to see things you'd rather not see about yourself and the world. But it's possible, completely possible. Not because the Buddha was special, but because the truth he discovered is available to anyone willing to look for it. So if you find yourself drawn to this teaching, if something in this story resonates with your own search for meaning and freedom, then consider it an invitation, not to believe anything, not to join anything, not to become anything, just to investigate, to pay attention, to see what's actually true in your own experience. Start simple. Notice your breath. Observe thoughts arising and passing. See how craving operates. Watch how attachment creates suffering. Experiment with letting go. Not forcing anything, just gently investigating what happens when you're not constantly trying to control and manage experience. The Buddha called it the middle way, and maybe that's the perfect description. Not too tight, not too loose. Not grasping, not suppressing. Just clear, steady attention to what is. Everything you need to know is right here, in this moment, in this breath, in this experience that you're having right now. The prince left his palace to find eternal stillness. The teacher pointed the way for countless others, and now, if you want it, the path is yours to walk. Before we end, here's where I ask for that small gesture of support. If this journey through the Buddha's life has given you something, if it sparked curiosity, or brought you peace, or simply helped you fall asleep in a more meaningful way, consider tapping that like button. It helps others find these stories. And if you want more explorations like this, more deep dives into history and philosophy and the human search for meaning, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you feel moved to. Where are you listening from? What time is it in your corner of the world? What drew you to this particular story? I read every comment, and there's something beautiful about imagining all of us, scattered across the globe, different time zones and cultures, all connected by curiosity about what it means to be human. The Buddha is resting under those sala trees in Kushinaga. The fire has burned out. The relics have been distributed. The teaching has spread across continents and centuries. And somewhere in India, a Bodhi tree still grows, descendant of the one that sheltered a determined seeker 2,500 years ago. Under that tree, or one like it, someone is sitting right now, practicing, investigating, following the same path that the Buddha walked, following breath, observing mind, seeing through the illusion of self. Generation after generation, the practice continues. You don't need a special place or special equipment or special permission to join this lineage. You just need to be willing to look, to see what's actually here beneath all the concepts and stories and beliefs. To find, in your own experience, the same truth that the Buddha found in his. The journey from palace to tree, to enlightenment, to teaching to death. It's not just one man's biography. It's a map, a template, a reminder that the human mind, when properly trained and directed, can break through delusion and find genuine freedom. That freedom is still available, right here, right now, in this very moment, as you drift towards sleep, or lie awake with thoughts spinning, or simply exist in that liminal space between awareness and rest. The Buddha would say, you're already there. You've always been there. Nirvana isn't somewhere else, something to achieve in the future. It's what's revealed when the veils of ignorance and craving fall away. When you stop creating suffering and see what was always underneath. All conditioned things are subject to decay. That was his final teaching. But he could have added, and the unconditioned, that never decays. That never changes. That's available now, has always been available, will always be available to anyone willing to see. So rest in that. Rest in the eternal stillness that the Prince discovered, that the teacher shared, that practitioners have verified again and again across millennia. Not as something to believe, but as something to investigate, something to realize for yourself. The story ends, but the teaching continues. In you, if you want it. In the next breath, in the next moment of clear seeing, in every instant when you choose awareness, over automaticity, presence over distraction, truth over comfort. The Buddha's journey is over. Yours, if you choose to walk it, is just beginning. Sleep well, and when you wake, remember, all you need is already here. You just have to pay attention.